I'm going to get you started with implementing Firebase Remote Config in Friendly Chat. Here's an overview of what you'll be implementing. First, you'll set up a list of default parameters for Firebase Remote Config. These are the locally defined fallback values that the app will use if the parameters aren't defined in the Firebase console. You'll set up a Firebase Remote Config instance with these values. Then, you'll fetch the values to the Firebase console for any remote config values that have changed. After that fetch, your object will be updated with the latest remote config values. Simple enough? Let's go to the code. The first step, like always, is to include the correct Gradle dependency. We're doing remote config, so I'm going to copy that. And then over here, in my app's Gradle file, I'll add it. And I'll sync to include the new library. As with the other services that you've implemented, you're going to need to make an object for this one as well. So I'm going to scroll down here, and in my instance variables, I will add a Firebase remote config object. And you'll also initialize it in the onCreate method. Okay, and now I'm going to start setting things up at the bottom of the onCreate method. I'll start by using a handy trick provided by the Firebase remote config object, enabling developer mode. You'll do this using a Firebase remote config settings object, and then you'll build it with developer mode enabled, like that. Then you can take your remote config object and set the config settings to the Firebase remote config settings that you just made. Note that this buildconfig.debug is a boolean created at build time, and it's true when you're using debug builds and false for release builds. That allows you to keep this configuration code around for both debug and release builds. Okay, now that that's done, you're going to define the parameter values for remote config, and you'll do that using a map object. And in the map object, you'll add the values for the parameters that you're going to be using. Now in Friendly Chat, you only really have one parameter, which is the message length. So in our hash map, we're going to add a key value pair for that message length. The key will be a constant called friendly message length key, and the default value for that will be the default message length. Okay, let's go ahead and define this key. I'm going to scroll up to the top of the class and add it right here. Okay, good. Okay, so now my default config map is set up, and I'm going to take my remote config object, and I'm going to call the setDefaults method and pass in that map. And that sets up Firebase remote config. Next, you actually need to try to fetch values from the server to see if any of the config values changed in your Firebase project. I'm going to separate this out in a new method called fetchConfig, which I'm going to call here. Okay, now let me define this method at the bottom of the class. The first thing that you want to do is specify the cache expiration time. I'm going to set it to an hour for production builds, and I'll set it for 0 for builds where developer mode is enabled. This is where our config settings come in. This allows us, when we're debugging it, to get the latest values from Firebase if there are any changes immediately. Next, we'll take our remote config object and call fetch to fetch the values, and we will also pass in the cache expiration time. But you're not finished yet, because you actually need to do something with those returned values. So what I'm going to do now is add two listeners, a success listener and a failure listener. Now when the fetch is successful, you can take your Firebase remote config object and call this method activateFetched. And this will do something called activating your parameters. And I'm going to make another helper method called applyRetrievedLengthLimit, which I will define down here. Okay, so the point of the applyRetrievedLengthLimit is to appropriately update the edit text length. And to do that, I'm going to take my Firebase remote config object and call this getLong method, passing in the friendly message key. Now if the fetch was successful, friendly message length will now contain what I got from the server, which then allows me to take my edit text and apply a filter, which updates the edit text length. And this is similar to what I do above here in onCreate when I'm first setting up the app. Okay, but let's go back down. And finally here, I'll just go ahead and add a log statement that prints out whatever our friendly message length is. Okay, so that's everything I need for the success case. For the failure case, I'm going to go ahead and write a log message, and then I will also call applyRetrievedLengthLimit. Now, this failure case will happen if you're offline, in which case down here, when I call mfirebase remote config and getLong, it's going to give me values from the cache. The cache may be different from your default parameter mapping, so it still makes sense to update the edit text length here.